In a world that forgets the dead too quickly, we remember. This is folk fear, where ancient soil still speaks, and every whispered tale has roots that run deeper than bones. Here, stories are not told, they rise from blood-soaked earth, from rusted rites, from the breath of ghosts who never truly left. Each tale we share is drawn from the marrow of forgotten villages, cursed rituals, and the cries of those bound to land, loss, and silence. These are not myths. These are warnings dressed in folklore, masked as tradition. And once you've heard them, the wind will never sound the same again. Tonight's story is no different. When the grieving is forced, when the land is bound to sorrow, what happens when a widow refuses to mourn? The fields remember, the plow waits, and the earth is hungry. Welcome to the Mourner's Plow. They say the soil here remembers everything. It remembers birth, it remembers death, and it remembers grief. Especially grief. Long before Mara Keldrin became a widow, before the land curdled and the plow began to whisper from the barn, Gravenhaal was already a village suspended between tradition and trembling. It sat quiet in the shadow of black hills, where wind had no melody and even the crows flew in circles, never daring to leave the sky above the fields. There were no machines here, no shining tools, no electric fences humming in the night. Only hands, only iron, only blood. To be born in Gravenhaal was to inherit the burden of the soil, the pact, unspoken and ancient, passed down in whispers at dusk. Every family had its field. Every field had its ghosts. And when a farmer died, the land did not rest until it was wept upon, turned over by mourning, by muscle, by memory. Not with tractors, not with oxen, but with the widow's own hands gripping the handles of the ancestral plow, dragging it through every row her husband once walked as her tears fell into the furrows. They called it the turning. It was not about crops, they said, not really. It was about debt, not money, not soil, but emotional debt owed to the land. The weight of sorrow must press into the earth before it would yield life again. No one dared to question it, not aloud. Mara had watched the ritual every year since she was a girl. Bent women staggering through thick mud, wailing wives with bleeding palms, fields groaning beneath the burden of mourning. And afterward the crops always came, impossibly lush, heavy with life, as if grief had fertilized them. But now it was Mara's turn, and she could not bring herself to do it. Not because the task was hard. She was strong. She had buried her husband alone, dug the hole herself, while the villagers watched from a distance, whispering about her silence. It was not sorrow that weighed on her. It was relief. Harlan Keldrin had been a cruel man, a man of fists, not words. He wore his authority like a second skin, not inherited from tradition, but carved from the fear he planted in her each season like seeds. The others knew, but in Gravenhaal, the dead were never spoken of with shame. Once they passed, they became part of the land, and land was sacred. So when Harlan choked on his own tongue one gray morning and collapsed into his porridge, Mara had not cried. She had stared, long and hard, as if daring his body to twitch. When it didn't, she had stood up slowly, wiped the bowl clean, and opened the window to let his spirit out. And then she went back to her chores. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, each evening she passed the barn without looking inside. She could feel it watching her, not the plow itself, but the presence tied to it. The rusted iron hulk, twisted and ancient, older than her grandfather's grave, now seemed to shift slightly when the wind blew. The villagers had noticed. They had begun to glance at her differently. Children no longer waved. Old men stopped asking if she needed help. She knew what they were waiting for: the mourner's plow. She had 7 days left to begin the turning. 7 days before the spring planting. 7 days before the soil demanded grief. But grief had no place in her chest. Her heart had been tilled raw under Harlan's heel for years. And now that she could finally breathe without bruising, the thought of mourning him made her stomach twist. So she refused, and the land began to change. It started with the silence. Birds stopped nesting in the trees near her home. The foxes no longer called from the edge of the woods. Then the dreams began, dreams of dragging, of her body laced to the plow, limbs trailing through blood-red furrows. Her husband's voice, soft now, not cruel, whispering behind her ear. "Mara, the land is waiting. The land never forgets unpaid grief." She would wake drenched in sweat, her nightdress clinging to her back, the smell of iron thick in her nostrils. But when she went outside, the sky looked the same, pale, overcast, unforgiving. Still, she would not weep. Still, she would not drag. That morning, she found a dead bird at the foot of her bed, clean, untouched, as if it had fallen through the roof, though the roof bore no holes. Its beak was filled with dirt. Its wings were open in surrender. She buried it beside her garden. That night, the soil in her vegetable patch began to pulse. Not move, pulse, like something beneath it was breathing. The village elder came the next day. Old Garrett was nearly blind, his eyes like milk turned sour, his back crooked like a scythe. He said nothing at first, just stood at her gate, hat in hand, staring at the ground. "I know what you came to say," Mara told him, her voice like gravel wrapped in cloth. "The land has needs," he simply replied, "and you owe it a sorrow. I have none left to give." He looked up then, not with pity, with fear. "Then the land will take what it's owed." He left before she could reply. That evening the wind blew from the south, the direction of the cemetery. It smelled like rot and plowed earth. Mara locked every door, bolted every shutter, but the barn door creaked open anyway. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the edge of her bed with a candle in hand, watching the hallway. And just before dawn, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping across soil. A long drag, then silence, then another drag, slow, purposeful, heavy, as if the plow had grown legs, or worse, as if someone had picked it up. The second morning after the dragging sounds, Mara stepped outside to silence that felt watched. The wind had vanished. Even the crows, those bold black sentinels of Gravenhaal, had abandoned the fields. Not a single wing cut the sky. The air hung thick and unmoving, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Beneath her feet, the soil was damp, but it hadn't rained in days. She crouched down, pressed her hand to the dirt near her doorstep. The ground was warm, throbbing faintly, like it had a heartbeat of its own. She pulled her hand back slowly. It came away streaked with red. Not blood, But not just earth either. It smelled alive. She didn't tell anyone. What would she say? That the plow had moved on its own? That the fields were breathing? That she'd buried a bird with dirt in its beak, and now the land was whispering her husband's name? In Gravenhaal, silence wasn't just survival, it was sacred. But that afternoon, as she walked to the well, she felt eyes on her from every cottage window. Curtains twitched, conversations died mid-breath. Even the baker, who once gave her leftover crusts for her chickens, turned away when she passed. No one mentioned the turning. They didn't need to. The unspoken weight of tradition sat heavy in the air, heavier than grief itself, and she was now the only one in the village not carrying it. That evening, she didn't cook. She sat by the fire listening. The logs snapped and sighed, but beneath it, deep under the crackle, there was something else, a scraping, a low grind like old metal being dragged through roots. It came and went in waves, almost too faint to notice, but once she heard it, she couldn't unhear it. It was coming from the barn. She left the fire burning and stepped outside. The night was wrong. The stars above Gravenhaal always flickered like faint candles, but tonight they were smudged behind a veil of moving clouds. Except the clouds weren't moving. The sky twitched. She lit a lantern, made her way to the barn. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her boots sank into the earth like she was walking through the breath of something slumbering just beneath the surface. The barn door creaked when she touched it, not from rust, but from resistance, like something inside didn't want her to enter. She opened it anyway, and there it was, the plow. Exactly where it had always been, angled against the far wall, rusted, ancient, too heavy for one person to lift. The iron was blackened now, darker than before, and wet in patches. She raised the lantern and stepped closer. The floor beneath it was scarred. Deep furrows in the packed dirt, long trails that hadn't been there before. They looked like drag marks, but not outward, inward, as if something had been pulled into the barn. She knelt down and touched one, still warm, still wet. Then she saw it, a small clump of fibers near the base of the plow, coarse, faintly golden. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a piece of Harlan's old coat, the one he used to wear when beating the fields, the one she'd burned after he died. She backed away slowly, lantern trembling in her grip, and then, creak. The plow shifted. Just a tremor, a twitch, but she saw it. It moved toward her, only an inch, but enough. She dropped the lantern. The flame died instantly as it struck the dirt, snuffed out like breath on a mirror. Darkness swallowed her. She didn't scream. She ran, all the way back to her house, barefoot now, boots lost somewhere in the field. Her breath tore through the night like knives. She didn't stop until she was inside, door slammed, bolts drawn, hands shaking against the wood. She didn't sleep that night. She watched the barn from her window until dawn. The plow never left, but she knew it could. The following morning, the crops had sprouted. It should have been impossible. No one had turned the fields, no one had sown the seeds, and yet green shoots stretched up from the soil like fingers clawing from graves, not in neat rows, but in veins, chaotic and curling, as if the earth itself had planted them. The villagers gathered in silence. They stood at the edges of the field, watching the unnatural growth. No one stepped forward. No one dared touch the plants. Mara stood among them, arms folded, face unreadable. Old Garrett arrived last. He shuffled toward the edge of the crops, bent low, and plucked a single shoot. It bled. Dark red sap ran down his fingers. The crowd recoiled. Garrett dropped the plant, wiped his hand on his coat, and turned to Mara. "You have until the new moon," he said quietly. She didn't reply. She walked away. That night, the children began to cough. Not colds, not fever. They coughed dirt. Fine black earth spilled from their mouths, clinging to their tongues, coating their teeth. Mothers wept, fathers prayed, but no one came to her door. The message was clear: mourn him, or more will suffer. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the plow handles burned into her memory. The feeling of them, the weight, the iron biting through grief. But her hands stayed empty. She could not cry for a man who broke her. She would not bend her knees to a lie carved into soil by fear, even if it cost her everything. That night, in her dream, she was the plow. Iron fused to flesh, her limbs rusted and twisted, her mouth full of earth. She dragged herself forward, over bones, over blood, over voices chanting in a tongue she almost remembered. And behind her, he followed, not with fists, with a smile. Harlan, pale and barefoot, his eyes hollow, his voice soft. "Mara, the land doesn't need your love, just your sorrow." She woke choking on dirt. When she opened her mouth, a worm fell out. By morning, the fields were no longer green. What had sprouted in the night no longer looked like crops. The shoots had grown taller, impossibly so, and turned the color of spoiled meat. Veins ran through their stalks, pulsing faintly beneath thin, translucent skin, and the tips, once leafy, had curled inward like closed fists. They swayed, though there was no wind. The villagers didn't gather this time. They stayed in their homes, shutters drawn, doors bolted. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers through cracked lips. Fathers sharpened knives without knowing why. No one went near the fields, except Mara. She stood at the edge of her land barefoot, arms folded over her chest, watching as the grotesque harvest shivered in the morning gloom. Flies circled above the tallest stalks. The air stank of copper and milk gone sour. She stepped forward. With each footfall, the soil sunk deeper beneath her weight. It clung to her soles like wet tongue, refusing to release her without effort. Still, she walked until she reached the first row. The plant in front of her breathed. Not metaphorically, not imagined. It rose and fell like lungs struggling for air. She knelt and touched it. It was warm, soft. She gripped the stalk and pulled. It resisted. Then, with a slick snap, it tore free. The roots, if they could still be called that, were tendon-like, red and wet. They squirmed in her hand, and the base of the stalk had teeth, tiny human-like teeth embedded in the flesh where the plant met the soil. She dropped it. It writhed for a moment on the ground, then stilled. From somewhere deeper in the field, a low groan echoed. Not animal, not wind, earth. The land was groaning. She stumbled back to the house, hands shaking, and scrubbed her skin until it bled. The smell wouldn't leave. It followed her, clung to her hair, filled her mouth. That night, she burned the clothes she wore in the field. She poured lamp oil over them and lit the match with steady hands. The fire hissed, spat, and then consumed, but as the flames ate through fabric, a sound rose from the center of the pile. A scream. Not hers, not Harlan's. Something deeper, older, something buried. She smothered the fire, heart hammering, eyes wide. Nothing remained in the ashes but bone. The next morning, 3 children were gone. Their beds were empty. No signs of struggle, no broken locks, no tracks in the dirt, just silence. And in one home, a single furrow dug through the floorboards, as if the earth had reached up and swallowed the child whole. The village bell rang once, not as a call to gather, but as a warning, the kind rung only during drought, or death, or desecration. Old Garrett stood at Mara's doorstep before dusk. He didn't knock, he simply waited. When she opened the door, he looked older than she remembered. Not weak, but withered, like a tree long denied sunlight. "You must do it," he said. "I told you, there's no grief in me." "Then fake it, for the sake of the land, for the sake of the children." She narrowed her eyes. "Would you mourn a man who broke your bones and called it love?" Garrett didn't answer. He looked past her, into the shadows of her home. "You think this is about your pain? It isn't. It never was. The land doesn't care about justice. It only feeds on sorrow. If it isn't yours, it will take someone else's." He handed her a small, rusted key. She knew what it opened. The barn. Then he turned and left, dragging his cane like a scythe behind him. That night, Mara stood before the barn with the key in her hand. The sky above was cracked with lightning. No thunder, just light tearing through black. The air stank of rust and wet leather. She opened the door. The plow was waiting. Its iron frame gleamed as if freshly polished. The rust was gone. The chains that hung from its sides swayed gently as if moved by breath. And beneath it, the floor was clean. No blood, no marks, no bones. Just dirt. Damp, freshly turned. She stepped inside. The door shut behind her, not slammed, closed. She didn't move. The barn went silent. Then, the chains lifted just an inch, then dropped. A warning, a greeting, a demand. She backed out slowly, heart racing, breath thin. Outside, she turned toward the field once more. The flesh plants had grown. Now they stood as tall as men, each stalk twisted in on itself as if writhing in pain. In the moonlight, their surface shimmered like wet skin. Some had begun to sag, leaking thick red sap that sizzled as it hit the ground. And somewhere, deep among them, something moved. Something large. Not the plow, not Harlan, something else. Watching, waiting, growing. Mara couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the sound of soil shifting beneath her floorboards. The house was old, but it had never groaned before. Not like this, not like him. She thought about the children, about the look in Garrett's eyes, about the scream that rose from the burning cloth. She thought about the dream that had come again the night before. Her dragged by the neck behind the plow, her skin flayed open from shoulder to heel, blood watering the earth as Harlan wept behind her. Not from grief, but from joy, because she finally looked the way he felt inside. Empty, used, his. She rose before dawn, wrapped her hands in cloth, dressed in black, and stood at the edge of the barn once more. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She opened the door, and the plow smiled. The morning sky was the color of rotted milk. No sun broke through, just a thick, low ceiling of clouds pressing down on the village like a hand upon a throat. Nothing moved, not the trees, not the wind, not the birds, because there were no birds left. And beneath the silence, the earth groaned. A deep, aching sound. Not thunder, not quake, a living sound, a wounded sound, like a breath caught in the chest of something buried too long. The villagers heard it, every one of them. They woke with blood in their mouths and soil beneath their nails. They found cracks in their walls where none had been, paintings tilted, doors stuck, floors buckled. The ground had begun to shift, not quickly, but intentionally, like something turning over in its sleep. The crops in Mara's field had bloomed overnight, not into flowers, not into fruit, but into faces, small, indistinct, twisted faces curled in agony along the sides of the stalks. Some were crying, some screaming. All had no eyes, just empty sockets gaping toward the house where Mara lived alone. The youngest child in the village began to chant. She stood in the road at dawn, barefoot and blank-eyed, whispering a song no one had taught her, a language that had no tongue, over and over until her voice cracked. Let the sorrow drag, let the sorrow drag, let the sorrow drag. They carried her inside. She kept singing, even in her sleep. Mara stood in the barn. She hadn't moved since the plow had smiled. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it was the curve of the rust, or the way the lantern light bent around old metal. Or maybe, just maybe, somewhere inside her, she wanted it to smile. Because if it smiled, it meant it could see her. And if it could see her, it might listen. She reached for the handles. They were cold. Not cold like iron in spring, but cold like something left in the dark too long. Cold like the breath of a crypt. Her fingers stiffened around the grip, skin twitching with memory. The last time she held anything this tightly, it had been Harlan's wrist. That night, the night he tried to make her kneel. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't run. She had gripped his wrist and pushed until something in his arm cracked like a rotting branch. He never touched her again. She had thought that moment was her liberation, but now the land wanted her to grieve him, to mourn a man she had already buried in her bones. She released the plow and backed away. The groan came again, louder, closer. The soil beneath the barn rippled, not in metaphor, in flesh. A bulge formed under the packed dirt. It rose, pushed, and split, not with blood, but with breath. Something exhaled from the earth, a hot, sour wind that smelled of sweat and rust. And then a whisper, so close it might have come from her own chest. Mara, one drag, just one drag. She fled. Outside, the field moved. She saw it from her porch, the way the stalks leaned, not with wind, but with awareness. They turned toward her, not all at once, one after another, like heads on broken necks snapping toward a sound. And the groaning rose into a wail from the earth itself, low, long, agonized. It rolled through Gravenhaal like a storm cloud dragging chains. The villagers covered their ears. Mothers screamed. Windows shattered. And beneath it all, the children began to bleed from their noses, their eyes, their mouths. Mara knelt in the dirt outside her house. The ground was warm again, beating, slow and steady, like a drum, like a demand. She pressed her palm to it. The earth sighed. Then, beneath her hand, it opened, a slit, a clean slice in the dirt like skin parting under a blade. From the wound rose a single root, long, black, wet. It curled around her wrist like a lover's hand. She tore away, fell back, panting. The slit closed, the ground healed, but the message was clear. It didn't want her grief, it wanted her. That night, the bells rang again, twice, and Gravenhaal understood. The village had 7 days left, 7 days before the land turned from hungry to angry, 7 days before the earth began to take whatever it wanted. Mara sat in the dark of her kitchen, a single candle flickering on the table. She had tried everything. She had screamed into the fields. She had burned Harlan's last possessions. She had gone to the cemetery and spat on his grave, but none of it satisfied the land, because it wasn't about truth. It was about ritual, and ritual didn't care who you were, only that you obeyed. That was the lie Gravenhaal was built upon, not the sanctity of soil, not the sacredness of the dead, but obedience. And now the village would suffer because she refused to play the part they wrote for her. Widow, weeper, willing vessel. The dream came again, but this time it changed. She was no longer behind the plow. She was the plow. Her body twisted into iron, her spine stretched into blades, her ribs bent into harnesses, and above her something stood, not Harlan, not man, but just a shape, tall, black, faceless, dragging her across a field of mouths. Each one screamed a name she had forgotten. Each one bit at her skin. And when she cried out, the shape behind her leaned close and whispered, "You don't get to bury what you never carried." She woke with her mouth full of soil and a single tooth in her hand.
The coughing began just after dawn, soft at first, ragged, then sharper, deeper, wet. The kind of cough that doesn't clear the throat but pulls something out from within. Mothers woke to the sound of their children choking on nothing. Fathers lit lanterns and found soil on pillows, streaked with mucus and blood. By noon, 9 children couldn't breathe. By sunset, 3 had collapsed. The healer, if she could still be called that, cut open the youngest's mouth and pulled out a clump of roots, thick with dark soil, wriggling slightly before it stilled. The village screamed behind closed doors. No one came to Mara. No one dared, because by now they all knew. This wasn't a curse. It wasn't a blight. It wasn't punishment. It was inheritance. The land was claiming what it was owed, and grief, unspilled, had turned to seed. Mara sat beside her hearth, sleepless, breath shallow, arms wrapped around herself like broken wings. The tooth she had found in her hand after the dream still sat on the table, small, yellow, human. It hadn't come from her. She checked over and over. It had come from the land, a sign, A warning, a threat, or maybe a gift. The fire cracked, and from its hiss, she heard him again. Soil remembers breath, Mara. That's why it's taking theirs. She stood. She didn't want to, but she did. Not from guilt, not from fear, but because something in her lungs felt heavy, as if dirt had settled there too, waiting. She walked barefoot to the window. The fields were moving again, not just swaying, but convulsing. The stalks twisted in place like things being wrung dry. From a distance, it looked like hundreds of bodies caught mid-seizure, writhing under moonlight, their skin glistening wet. She opened the door, and the air rushed in like a scream. It stank of iron, of wet leaves, of rot. But underneath it, deep beneath the breath of decay, was something colder, familiar. Harlan's scent, tobacco and sweat. She nearly fell. Outside, the sky had turned the color of old bruises, yellow where it should be blue, black where it should be light. And the plow was no longer in the barn. It stood in the center of her field, alone, waiting, its chains dragged behind it like tails, its blade buried in the soil. The stalks had bent away from it, forming a perfect circle, as though the land itself bowed. And she knew it had come to her. So she walked. The moment her feet touched the field, the groaning stopped. Not faded, stopped, as if the land itself had frozen in breath. Each step forward was harder than the last. The earth clung to her soles, pulled at her ankles, sucked at her toes. She passed the rows of twitching plants, each one now covered in thick, glistening bulbs that looked like blistered eyes, sealed shut by skin. From the corners of some, dark sap bled like tears. She didn't flinch. She didn't stop. The plow loomed ahead. It was taller now, thicker, its iron twisted like muscle. It was becoming something else, becoming him. She reached the handles, placed her hands upon them. They pulsed beneath her grip, alive, a heartbeat, slow, cold, familiar. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she felt the weight of every woman who had done this before her. Every wife who dragged this plow behind her ribs, every widow who buried her voice in the soil so the next season might live. And suddenly, rage rose in her throat, not just for Harlan, but for them, for herself, for the lie they called mourning, because this wasn't grief, it was sacrifice. She let go, stepped back, and whispered into the night, "I am not yours." The earth beneath her split. A crack, fast and silent, ran from her heel to the plow, then outward in every direction. The field shuddered, the stalks hissed, and from the soil came a new sound, breathing, thousands of shallow breaths, all in unison, all beneath the earth. She dropped to her knees, pressed her ear to the dirt, and what she heard shattered her. Children, weeping, gasping, calling her name. She ran, through the rows, through the cries, through the blistered plants that reached for her as she passed. She stumbled into the village square, barefoot, shaking, covered in mud and tears. "They're under the soil," she screamed. "The children, they're under the soil." Doors opened. Faces emerged, pale, terrified. Garrett stepped forward, lantern in hand, eyes sunken. "They were never meant to be taken," he said softly. "Only warned. The land wanted you." "I won't give it what it wants."
then it will take what it needs. The bell rang once more, and under their feet, the earth began to rise. All across Gravenhaal, small mounds pushed upward from the ground, some in fields, some in homes, some under cribs, one in the center of the square. Mara stared at the mound near her toes as it grew, slowly splitting open, revealing a mass of hair and soil and bone, and a face, a child's face, mouth open, eyes gone, skin fused with root. It whispered, not with voice, but with memory. A vision poured into Mara's mind of the first turning, centuries ago, a woman dragging the plow alone, sobbing, her blood falling into the furrows. Behind her, a shadow, the same shape from her dreams, watching, feeding, and beneath them, the soil opened, took her child, took her name, took herself. She screamed, and the ground swallowed the scream whole. Back in her home once more, Mara stood before the mirror. There was dirt in her eyes now, in her teeth, in her lungs. Each breath came slower, heavier, like something else was breathing through her. She clutched the frame of the mirror and spoke aloud, voice cracking, "What do you want from me?" Behind her, in the reflection, the plow stood in the doorway. It had come home.
That night, Mara didn't go to bed. She didn't need to. Sleep took her where she stood, not gently, not slowly, but all at once, as if the room itself had blinked and she had vanished from waking. And in that dark, breathless space, the dream returned. But this time, it began with pain. Her body dragged across the ground, naked, bleeding, bound at the wrists by rusted iron, her arms stretched behind her like roots torn from wet soil. Her skin peeled away beneath her like parchment across jagged stone. The earth was not soft here. It was sharp, broken, full of bone. She was not alone. The plow was behind her. But it was not the plow. It was Harlan. His shape, his shadow, his voice, his hunger. She couldn't see him, but she felt the rhythm of his steps, deliberate, slow, unyielding, driving the blade forward as it carved a line through her spine. Each breath she tried to take filled her lungs with soil, and with every inch of earth they crossed, the world shifted. No sky, no stars, only fields, endless, endless fields, each furrow a scar, each scar a memory, and the land whispered them all. She saw the widow before her, the first, barefoot, blood running from her mouth, dragging the plow with both hands as her child watched from the woods. Then the next, older, her husband's bones tied to the blade behind her. Then another and another, a line of grief too long to count. Each woman bent, broken, swallowed. Each one told it was sacred. Each one told it was duty. And above them all, that thing, the shape without a name, the one the village never spoke of, the one that fed not on crops, but on suffering, sewn into tradition. Mara wanted to scream, but her mouth was full of teeth, not her own, small, childlike, hundreds of them jammed between her lips. She spat and spat, but more came. She clawed at her face. The plow creaked behind her, and a voice leaned low into her spine. If you will not grieve him, you will become him. She woke gasping, but the dream clung to her,
like cobwebs soaked in blood. The room was cold, colder than it had ever been. The fire was ash, the windows fogged with breath. But she was alone, or so she thought. Then she saw them, tiny footprints in the ash by the hearth, not child-sized, smaller, bone-thin, soil-streaked, leading from the window to her bed and back again. She followed them to the window. Outside, the field was alive, moving, not with wind, with intention. The stalks twisted like spines, the bulbs pulsed like hearts, and in the center of it all stood the plow, waiting, as always. She stepped outside, barefoot again. She didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the ground. She barely felt her own body anymore, like something had hollowed her out and left only breath behind. The stalks parted for her this time, like curtains, like ribs. They welcomed her. And in the clearing, the plow pulsed, its chains wrapped in roots now, its handle split with age. She touched it, and it moaned, not mechanically, not like iron, but like him. And suddenly she was there again, in the dream, only now she was watching herself from behind the stalks, bent, bleeding, dragging. She looked so small, so ruined, but her eyes, they weren't crying. They were open, unblinking, defiant. And in the dream's wind, the voice came again. You must give the land what it asks, or you will never leave. She turned. Behind her, the village stood. But it wasn't the village. It was their faces. The women, all of them, lined up shoulder to shoulder, with dirt in their mouths and grief in their eyes. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just watched. Judging? Begging? It was impossible to know. One stepped forward. Her face was lined like bark, her hair braided with twigs. She opened her mouth and whispered something Mara couldn't hear. Mara stepped closer. The woman leaned in and exhaled a scream directly into her mouth. Mara staggered back, and when she looked again, they were all gone. She woke on her porch, covered in mud, her feet raw, her hands streaked with rust. The plow sat beside her, closer than it had ever been, almost tender, like a dog that had followed her home. She didn't touch it. She didn't move. She just sat and listened. Because beneath her, far beneath the layers of stone and bone and memory, the land was still groaning, no longer in hunger, but in mourning. And for the first time in years, Mara felt the edge of a tear form in her eye. But she didn't let it fall. Not yet. Not for him. Not until the earth earned it. The morning air was still, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. Gravenhaal had become a place without sound. The wind no longer visited. The birds had long fled. Even the insects had gone still, their wings folded in reverence or fear. And underneath it all, beneath the dirt, beneath the roots, beneath the bones, something ancient listened. The plow had not moved from her porch. It sat hunched like a beast waiting for command, its chains coiled beside it like sleeping serpents. Mara hadn't touched it, but each time she passed, it seemed closer to her door. The villagers didn't speak to her anymore. They walked with eyes lowered, prayers mumbled into their sleeves. The children no longer coughed, but some had stopped speaking altogether. They simply sat in corners,
drawing spirals in the dirt with fingers that trembled. One child traced a perfect map of the fields down to the last row. She had never been there. That afternoon, Mara returned to the barn. She didn't know why, only that her feet moved without command, drawn by something deeper than thought. When she opened the door, she expected to find it empty. The plow was still on the porch, but the barn was not empty. In the center of the floor was a shallow pit, freshly dug, its edges raw, the soil damp. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in old linen. Her breath caught. She stepped forward and knelt. The cloth was tied with twine, brittle with age. She undid the knot, hands shaking, not from fear, but from recognition. Before the linen fell away, she already knew what it would be. Bones. Small. Curved. A child. No name, no grave marker, just silence. She stared at them, blinking back tears she didn't know were there. Then she heard it, a whisper. Not outside, not around, within, like the bones were remembering and sharing it with her. She saw the first turning again, but not as a dream. She was inside the memory now. The first widow stood barefoot in the frost, her dress torn, her eyes hollow. Her husband lay behind her, freshly buried beneath a mound of stones. Around her, villagers stood in silence, young, pale, expectant. They did not help her lift the plow, they only watched. The plow was smaller then, less rusted, but no less cruel. She dragged it through the frost while her baby cried from the barn. When she reached the end of the field, she collapsed. No one helped her up. And when she returned to the barn, the baby was gone. In its place, a furrow in the dirt, still warm, still open. The villagers said nothing. The next harvest was the largest the village had ever seen. They called it sacred. Mara snapped back to herself in the barn, the memory fading like steam. She looked at the bones again, and this time she whispered, "I'm sorry." The plow creaked from the porch, like it had heard, like it approved. That night the villagers lit no candles. They sat in darkness, listening. The groaning had returned, lower now, more constant, like something old had settled beneath their homes and begun to breathe through the stone. Walls cracked, chimneys wept soot, wells ran black, and above them all, the moon bled at the edges. Mara didn't sleep. She sat beside the bones and listened. They had more to say, more to show. Visions came not as dreams, but as pulses through her fingertips, each beat a memory not hers. The second widow, the third, the fifth, each one younger than the last, each one dragged behind tradition like a dog chained to grief. One tried to run. She made it as far as the river. The plow followed. It was never just metal. It was always him. The one beneath the field. The one the elders called by no name. The one who fed not on love, but on loss. The one who had been seeded long ago by blood, by sorrow, by silence. He was the bargain struck when the land first refused to grow. Mara rose before dawn. She buried the bones behind her home, not in a field, not for the land, but in the place where her mother once planted violets. She whispered no prayers, only names, made up ones, soft ones, the kind a child might have wanted. And for the first time, the earth did not groan, it sighed. At sunrise, the plow was gone, so was her porch. In its place, a fresh furrow, long and deep, carved from her door to the edge of the field. No footsteps, no drag marks, just one perfect line, as if something had been carried. She followed it, all the way to the center of the field. There, in a circle of flattened stalks, the plow waited. But it looked different now. It had changed. Its iron gleamed in the morning light. Its chains now looped like arms, folded in rest. And at the center of the blade, a face, faint, but hers, carved in rust. She turned away, walked back to her home, and waited. Because now she understood. This wasn't about him. This wasn't even about the land. This was about memory. And memory, like grief, was never meant to be buried alive.
It was the sound that woke her. Not loud, not sudden, but steady. A scraping, iron on earth. A pull, a pause, another pull. She rose slowly, not from sleep, but from stillness. The hour before dawn was always the thinnest, when the world still held its breath and the line between dream and memory stretched like wet cloth. She didn't need to light a lamp. The pale blue haze of morning seeped through her window, enough to cast long shadows. And there, beneath the window frame, was the trail, a single furrow, fresh and deep, cut through her yard. It hadn't been there the night before. She stepped outside barefoot. The frost bit her skin, but she didn't flinch. The path led down the slope behind her house, past the place where she had buried the bones, past the empty chicken coop, past the splintered fence her husband had once built in silence and rage. It ended at the barn, and the barn door was open. Inside, it waited. The plow, standing upright now, like a man, its iron frame bent at angles that once seemed fixed, its handles arched back like shoulders drawn with breath. The chains looped like arms, and in the center of its frame, rust had bloomed into something that looked like ribs. It was evolving, or remembering, becoming what it once was, or what it had always been. Mara stepped inside. The barn door creaked behind her, and the plow turned. It turned, on its own. No wheels, no pulleys. It shifted toward her, not fast, not violently, but like a child stirring from sleep. She backed away slowly, breath held. And then she saw them. Footprints, not hers, not Harlan's. Smaller, older, layered one over another in the barn dust. Each one dried with time. Some barefoot, some bleeding, some tiny enough to belong to a child just learning to walk. They circled the plow, over and over, worn paths in dust and memory. She dropped to her knees, touched one, and the barn disappeared. She stood in a field that was not hers. The sky above was red. The soil beneath her feet was black and wet like meat left too long in the sun. And before her stood the plow, dragging itself forward. No one pulled it. No beast led it. It moved of its own will, and behind it furrows opened wide. From them women crawled, all silent, all weeping,
Each wore a veil of roots. Each carried in her mouth a stone with a name carved into it. She tried to speak, but when she opened her mouth, only soil fell out. She gasped awake on the barn floor, covered in sweat, but the air was freezing. The plow had not moved, or maybe it had and returned. She didn't know anymore. Time bent inside the barn. Days curled into themselves like snakes, dreams tangled with memory, and grief had stopped needing her permission. It simply was. That day, the villagers gathered at her gate. All of them. Even Garrett. No one spoke. They just stood silent, broken, afraid, holding torches. She stepped outside, arms bare, throat tight. "What do you want?" she asked, though she already knew. Garrett stepped forward. "The land is taking too much. Children are hearing voices. Old men sleepwalk into the fields. We found a woman buried to her chest in her own garden, her mouth filled with worms." Mara said nothing. He looked at her with eyes like dry wells. "You must do it." She shook her head. "I don't mourn him." Garrett stepped closer. "This isn't about him anymore. It's about you. The land doesn't need your grief for him. It needs your grief itself. Anything will do." Mara whispered, "Then why not take yours?" Garrett looked away, and Mara saw it. The guilt, the knowledge. He had dragged the plow once. She hadn't known. Few had. It had been decades ago, when his brother drowned in the well. Not a husband, not a wife, but grief nonetheless. Grief had rules here, and none of them were fair. That night, she stayed in the barn, alone. No fire, no blanket, only the plow. She sat beside it, waiting, not for it to move, but for herself to feel something she hadn't in years. A crack, a break, a tear. But nothing came. Not sorrow, not rage, not even fear. Only silence. Only memory. Only the scent of iron and the low creak of metal settling. Until, from behind her, a breath. Slow. Wet. Too close. She turned, and there he stood, Harlan. As he had been in life, boots caked in field mud, shirt stained with sweat, eyes flat and unspeaking. But this time, he wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He simply raised one hand and pointed to the plow, then to her heart, then to the ground, and when she looked down, her chest was open, ribs peeled wide like petals, and inside, soil, not blood, soil, soft, wet, waiting. She screamed herself awake, but when her eyes opened, she was already standing in the field, hands on the plow, bare feet, mouth full of dirt. And behind her, a single furrow carved in her wake. The furrow she had carved in her sleep stretched behind her like a wound. Not straight, not neat. It curled through the field like a question mark. as if the earth itself wasn't sure where it wanted her to go. But Mara's hands still gripped the plow, and her feet still moved, even though she had no memory of taking the first step. Her night dress was soaked to the knee with dew and something darker. Her shoulders ached, her breath came in short gasps, but still she walked. With every footfall, the soil pulsed beneath her, and the plow groaned softly, like it was pleased. She stopped when the blade hit something. Not a rock, not a root. Something that thudded, hollow. She stepped around the blade, dropped to her knees, and dug. The dirt came away easily, as if it wanted to be opened. Within seconds, her fingers scraped against surface, hard, smooth, rounded. Bone. She dug faster, more. A skull, then ribs, then a spine, twisted unnaturally, then smaller bones beside them. A child's. She fell back, breath sharp in her throat. The plow loomed behind her, silent, not moving now, as if watching. She wasn't surprised. Not anymore. She had known in some quiet chamber of her heart that the fields were seeded with more than grain. Each harvest grew fat on sorrow, and sorrow had a source. She stood, brushing soil from her knees, and whispered into the wind. How many? The earth answered. It trembled. And all across the field, small mounds rose, dozens, then hundreds, like bubbles rising in a stew. Every one of them marked by a whisper she could not hear, until suddenly she could. A chorus, low, soft, 1,000 names carried on the wind, too faint to repeat, too sacred to forget. She returned to her home with hands shaking and mind splintered. Inside, the air was thick with something sweet and rotten. Flowers had begun to bloom through her floorboards, small white buds with red tips, swaying though there was no breeze. The plow had followed her. It stood just outside her door, framed in shadow, watching, always watching. That evening, the village met without her. They lit no fires. They spoke in hisses. Some called for the field to be burned, others for Mara to be removed. Garrett said nothing at all, only sat beneath the dead tree in the square, fingers pressed to his temples, eyes distant. When someone asked what should be done, he finally answered, "It's not her fault. It's never been her fault." Then he stood, walked into the dark, and was not seen again that night. Mara sat at her kitchen table, staring at the map she had drawn in ash and dust, a crude sketch of the field, of the furrows, of the bones. Her hands moved without thought now, marking each grave, each trail, each echo. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, she only wrote, until she heard a knock, not on the door, from beneath the floorboards. A slow, deliberate knock, then silence, then another. 3 knocks. She rose, stepped to the center of the room. The boards beneath her feet were warm. She knelt, pressed her ear to the wood, and heard breathing. From below, she dug, with her hands, with her teeth, with rage. She tore up the floorboard, ripped through the packed earth, clawed through decades of dust and rot and root, until her fingers hit something solid. Wood, old, charred, a coffin, but not a full-sized one. She opened it. Inside, a dress, child-sized, stained, wrapped around a set of bones. On top of the bundle, a name, scratched into slate. But not her name. His. She staggered back, staring, because she knew now. This was not a child he lost. This was a child he hid, a child no one had spoken of, a child the land had never been given. And the plow had known. It had followed her not for her sorrow, but for her truth. And now that she had found it, the field groaned, not in hunger, but in relief. And outside, the sky began to bleed. The villagers came at dusk, torches in hand, not in anger, but in surrender. They stood outside her home and waited. One by one they laid offerings at her door. Shoes, ribbons, cracked toys, rusted spoons. Each one they whispered a name aloud, then left it behind, then walked away. Mara didn't stop them. She gathered each token, placed them on the table beside the bones, and listened as the house sighed. At midnight she returned to the field. The plow stood ready, the furrow already open. She did not weep, but her hands were steady, and her voice, when she spoke, was clear. No more hiding. She placed the bones into the furrow, and for the first time, the earth closed gently. No groan, no scream, only stillness, only silence, and the smell of something old finally being allowed to rot.
The next morning arrived without a sun. Light came, but dimly, filtered through a sky choked with low gray clouds, the kind of light that doesn't warm, only reveals. And in that pale hush, the field looked different. The earth no longer pulsed, it waited. The plow stood exactly where she had left it, blade half buried, chains still glistening from dew or something deeper. It no longer loomed, no longer threatened. It stood still, patient, as if the land was holding its breath, and the woman it waited for was finally ready. Mara dressed in black, not the ceremonial veil, not the widow's shawl the village had offered her weeks ago. She wore her own clothes, the ones Harlan had hated, the rough ones, the ones meant for labor, not grace. And over her shoulders she wore the leather straps she had stitched herself the night before. Not because she wanted to carry the plow, but because this time she would choose how. She stepped outside. The village watched from behind curtains. They made no sound, but she felt them. The eyes, the breath, the hope. She didn't look back. She walked to the plow and placed her hands on the handles. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the iron grew warm beneath her palms. The soil ahead shifted. A single furrow opened before her. Not a demand, an invitation. And this time, she accepted. She began to pull. The first step was harder than she expected. The blade caught on something beneath the dirt. Her arms strained, her breath hitched. But she kept moving, slowly, deliberately. She felt each stone, each root, each memory clinging to the underside of the soil. With every drag, her mind split open. She didn't see her own life pass before her. She saw theirs, the women, the widows, the lost. One by one, they walked beside her in silence. Not ghosts, not visions, presences. Their hands not on the plow, but on her shoulders, steadying her, blessing her, bearing witness. The plow moaned beneath her grip, but this time it wasn't pain, it was release. as if for the first time in generations, it wasn't being forced to feed, it was being heard. She reached the end of the field just before dusk. Her body ached, her feet were raw, her throat dry, but her heart, strangely, was still. She let go of the handles, and the plow sank, slowly, gracefully, as if being lowered into a grave. The chains curled like vines around the blade, the soil folded over it row by row, until only the very tip remained, rusted and still, like a marker. She said nothing. The earth said nothing back, but the silence no longer frightened her. She returned home without fanfare. No one followed, no one approached. But when she arrived, something had changed. Laid across her doorstep was a bundle of white flowers, and beneath it, a note in a trembling hand. For the sorrow you gave freely, and the silence you broke. There was no name. There didn't need to be. That night, she lit a fire for herself. No memory, no ritual, just warmth, just life. She sat in the glow and watched the flames dance across her hands. Not calloused, not broken. Used, but not ruined. The dream returned, but it had changed. She stood in the same field, the same sky, but the soil no longer writhed. The furrows were closed, the plow was gone, and from the earth, flowers grew. Each one shaped like an open eye, watching, but not judging, simply aware. From behind her, footsteps approached. Not heavy, not cruel, small, light. She turned and saw the child. She didn't know her name, but she knew her face. It was the girl from the bones, whole now, smiling, mouthful of laughter, not soil. The child placed a hand over Mara's heart and whispered one word, enough. Mara awoke weeping, and this time she let it happen. Not for Harlan, not for the others, but for herself. For the part of her that had waited too long for permission to grieve, for the little girl inside her that had never been allowed to cry, for the bones buried in silence, and the field that had held them all. Outside, the sun finally rose, and for the first time in weeks, it was golden. The stalks in the field had shriveled overnight, their skin cracked, their roots exposed. They no longer pulsed or moved. They simply withered and fell. But the soil beneath them, black and wet and clean, breathed gently, alive, ready. That night, after the weeping stopped, after the silence settled, and after the fire burned down to soft orange ash, Mara heard the door creak open. But no wind followed. No footsteps either, just the smell. Tobacco, sweat, iron, and the scent of him. She didn't turn around. She didn't reach for the poker beside the hearth or the rusted blade on the table. She simply sat there, still, shoulders squared, heart steady. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. The air thickened behind her. The room pulsed once, like the house exhaled. Then his voice slid across the floorboards. "Mara." Soft, familiar, too soft. Harlan had never spoken like that in life. He barked, he growled, he cursed. This voice was new, shaped to comfort, not control. But grief has a perfect memory, and she recognized the performance. "You're not him," she said flatly. Silence. Then a shift in the shadows, a flicker in the air, a distortion just enough to bend the firelight along the far wall. She turned now and saw him standing in the doorway. But it wasn't him. Not really. It wore his face, creased in the places she remembered, the lazy scowl, the sun-dark skin. But the eyes were too deep, not dark, deep, like pits, like the bottom of a well no voice could echo back from. She stood, and the thing that wore Harlan's face smiled. "Why come back now?" she asked it. "To thank you." The voice was too smooth, too calm, a butcher whispering lullabies. "For setting me free," it added. She didn't respond, because this wasn't about answers. It was about closure, and the dead don't give it freely. It stepped forward, not with menace, but with familiarity. The way he used to walk through the house at night, half drunk, half ashamed, breathing too heavily. That rhythm, that weight. The floor didn't creak beneath him. The air did. "I did everything they asked," she said. "I gave the field what it wanted. I gave the bones their names." "You did," it nodded. "And still you come." It didn't answer, just stood there, watching her. Then finally, "You never mourned me." "No." "Why?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because mourning is for the lost, not for the ones we're better without." The thing wearing Harlan's face smiled wider now, and its mouth was too big, too wide, too wrong. Its teeth were small and square and many, more than a mouth should hold. "You were never meant to mourn me," it said. "You were meant to remember." She stared. Remember? Was that what this was? Was that what all of it had been? The dragging, the plow, the blood in the field, the coughing children? Was it all just a way to keep the memory alive? Was that what the land demanded? Not grief, not pain, but presence. The thing took another step, and Mara felt the floor beneath her shift. The house bent inward slightly, like gravity itself leaned toward him. Not in threat, but in inevitability. He raised one hand, palm out, as if offering something. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply said, "You're not welcome here." And the fire behind her flared for just a second, enough for light to touch the shadow's face again. And in that second, it flickered. Not just the image, the entire shape. Harlan's face cracked like dry earth, and beneath it, something older, boneless, wide-mouthed, fleshless, made not of form, but of memory, made of sorrow too long unspoken. It lunged. No feet, no arms, just movement. She dropped to the floor, rolled beneath the table. It hit the wall behind her with the sound of thunder wrapped in metal. The entire house shook, plaster cracked, the candles died. Darkness swallowed the room, but Mara didn't scream. She crawled, through the dark, through the heat, toward the one place she knew he wouldn't follow, the field. She burst through the door, barefoot in the frost, hands bloodied from the floorboards. The stalks were gone now. The field lay bare, freshly turned, wet from recent mourning. She stepped into it and kneeled, pressed her palm to the dirt, and whispered, "I remember." The wind stirred, first time in days, and from the earth a hand reached up, small, soft, childlike. Not Harlan, not monster, but her. The girl she used to be, the one who used to cry into her pillow, the one who used to trace bruises and call them accidents,
the one who had never been given the space to feel anything but fear. Mara took that hand, held it tight, and felt the earth beneath her hum. The house behind her groaned once more, then went still. When she returned to it, the doorway was empty. No shadow, no shape, just smoke. The thing that wore her husband's face was gone, and on the floor where he had stood, a pile of old rust, twisted, cracked, the last fragment of the plow, no longer iron, only ash. She gathered it in her hands and walked it back to the field, where she let it scatter in the wind. No prayers, no sobbing, only one word spoken with grace: never again.
The morning came not with light, but with stillness. No birds, no voices, no wind. Only the faint rustle of something beneath the soil, alive, shifting. It wasn't restless anymore. It was ready. Mara stood barefoot in the field, the grass still wet from the season's sorrow. Around her, the village held its breath. No one approached, but they watched. Not out of fear this time, but reverence. Because the plow was gone, burned, scattered, released. And still, Mara walked the field. She dragged nothing behind her. No rusted blade, no weight of metal, only memory. And that was enough. They say grief must leave a mark. But what if the mark is movement? What if the act of walking, of returning, of placing bare feet upon land soaked in loss is enough? Mara walked each row in silence, her shadow stretching behind her like a second soul, her hands open at her sides, palms facing the earth. The turning was never about the plow. It was never about the iron or the sweat or the sacrifice. It was about being seen by the land, by the dead, by herself. With every step, the soil warmed beneath her. Not unnaturally, not fevered, just softened, as if the roots beneath her recognized her, accepted her, released their grip. No more groaning, no more hunger. Just the quiet rhythm of life, beginning again. When she reached the end of the first row, she turned, and the villagers gasped. Because behind her, the earth had bloomed. Where her feet had passed, green shoots emerged, but not like the cursed crops before. These were different, thin, gentle, pale green with silver edges. They swayed softly, though the air was still, as if greeting her, as if grieving with her. Garrett stepped forward from the crowd, no longer hiding behind age or guilt. He carried no torch, no cane, only a handful of violet seeds. He offered them wordlessly. She took them, scattered them into the wind, and watched as the earth opened its hands to receive them. That night, the bells did not ring, not once, not for warning, not for mourning, but because there was nothing left to fear. The plow was gone. The field was at rest. The land was no longer owed a debt, and grief no longer needed to scream to be heard. Mara sat alone in the barn for the last time.
The pit where the bones had been was filled now with soil, with story, with silence. And above it, a single stone, not carved, not inscribed, just placed. Because not all names survive, but the memory of presence does. And sometimes, that's all that's needed. The children no longer coughed. They played again, but their games had changed. They no longer chased. They planted. They gathered in small circles and pushed seeds into the earth with care, not because they were told to, but because they felt something beneath their feet. Something ancient, something sacred, something watching, but not waiting, not anymore. The old women of the village began to hum again, a song with no words, just notes passed down through blood and breath. The same song Mara had once heard her mother hum before sleep, and now, when she closed her eyes, she heard the field hum back. Not in sorrow, in peace. There is a turning that happens in every woman, a moment when silence becomes stone, when grief hardens into ritual, when breath forgets how to shake. But if she is lucky, if she survives, there is another turning that follows, one made not of metal, but of choice. And Mara had chosen. She had walked the rows, given the names, broken the cycle, and the land had listened. At last.
The days grew quiet after the turning. No more coughing from the children. No more groans from the field. Even the wind returned, not as a scream, but a whisper, gentle as a breath across the cheek of a sleeping child. But on the seventh night, the ground moved again. Not in anger, not in hunger, in invitation. It began beneath the old tree in the village square. A long, slow crack bloomed across its roots, soft at first, barely audible, then deeper, louder, until the earth sighed open. The villagers gathered in silence. They brought no torches this time, no tools, no chants, just themselves, barefoot, hands empty, eyes wide. Mara arrived last. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer warnings. She simply walked to the edge of the opening and listened. From the darkness below came a low hum, like a song without words, sung in voices no longer breathing. It wasn't mournful. It was familiar. It was the sound she'd heard in her dreams, the sound of before. Without speaking, the villagers stepped forward one by one. Each placed something at the edge: a button, a coin, a lock of hair, a broken doll, a name whispered so softly it fell apart before it reached the air. Then they stepped back, and the earth, slowly, slowly, began to close. Not devouring, not swallowing, sealing, like a scar after healing. The tree shuddered once, then stilled, and from the center of its trunk a new branch sprouted, small, golden, alive. They called it the root wake, not a grave, not a shrine, but a threshold, a place where the past no longer begged for sacrifice, only remembrance. where grief did not demand blood, only honesty, where mourning was no longer a duty, only an offering freely given. And beneath that tree, the earth held it all. The pain, the silence, the women, the children, the secrets, and the sorrow. All buried now, but not forgotten. Never again. Mara returned to her field the next morning. The rows had begun to grow in strange patterns, not straight, not predictable. They curved gently like waves, and where once cursed stalks had risen, now bloomed flowers she did not know. They had no name, but they smelled of violet and smoke, and when the wind passed through them, they sang softly, like a lullaby hummed by someone long gone. She found the last piece of the plow beneath her porch, one broken tooth of rusted iron, small, bent, almost harmless now. She wrapped it in cloth and buried it at the far corner of her land, under the old water pump, where Harlan used to stand and drink in silence. She placed no stone above it, no marker, just pressed her hand to the soil and whispered, "This is the last grief I owe you," then walked away. That night the dream changed once more. She stood in the same field, but the sky was no longer heavy. It was open, stars visible again, wind in her hair. And all around her stood the women, not broken, not bleeding, whole, smiling, some barefoot, some holding flowers, all watching her. They did not speak, but they thanked her, not with words, but with presence. And one by one they walked into the earth, not swallowed, not taken, welcomed, like children returning home. She awoke to birdsong for the first time in months. The window open, the air fresh, the floor beneath her feet warm, not from fire, but from life. The field no longer asked anything from her. The land no longer ached. The silence she had lived in for years, inside her chest, her throat, her hands, was finally gone, and something new had taken its place. Not joy, not peace, but truth, and truth was enough. The seasons changed softly that year. No flood, no frost, no plague rising from the field. Only sun, then rain, then warmth. The soil did not groan, it sighed. And when it breathed, it brought forth green. But not the green of desperation, not the twisted, bleeding stalks of before. These were gentle shoots, round-leafed, slow to rise, steady. They didn't race toward the sky, they waited. And the village learned to wait with them. Mara rose with the sun now, not because she was chased by dreams, but because the light felt earned. Each morning, she walked the edges of the field, tracing the curve of the rows. She touched the plants as she passed, whispering nothing, asking for nothing, just present, alive. Some mornings, the children followed her, barefoot, eyes bright, not in fear, not in silence, just curiosity. Some carried satchels of seeds, others brought flowers, and one, Elin, Garrett's granddaughter, sang to the soil. it responded. Little sprouts curling toward her voice like fingers reaching for music. The villagers stopped calling it her land. Now they called it the remembering field, because it grew things no one planted. Roses where an old love had been lost, lavender where a child had once fallen sick, even a single white tree, slender and strange, rising from the place where the plow had once been burned. Its bark shimmered faintly. No one dared touch it, but on certain nights, if you stood close enough, you could hear it humming softly, like the breath of someone who had finally forgiven. Mara built a bench beneath it, not for visitors, for herself. She sat there every evening as the sky turned amber, watching the horizon curve gently against the hills. She no longer thought about what the earth might take. She thought about what it had taught. That grief was not a curse, it was a compass. That silence was not survival, it was a burial. And that the body remembers everything the mouth cannot say. The old rituals faded. No more turnings, no more forced mourning. Instead, each home kept a grief bowl, a small clay dish placed on the windowsill, filled with a handful of earth. Whenever someone lost something, a parent, a pet, a piece of themselves, they placed a petal or a note or a hair into the bowl. And the bowl held it, not to take, not to feed, just to witness. And on the first rain after the new moon, the villagers brought their bowls to the remembering field and scattered their contents into the wind, not for the land, but for themselves. Mara lived many more years, not quietly, not loudly, but fully. She laughed again, taught the children how to plant in curved rows, how to kneel with gratitude, not fear. She told them about the plow only once, and when she did, she made no monsters of it, only warnings. Tools remember the hands that built them, and the hands that bled on them. She never remarried. She never left, because she no longer had to run from anything. The field was no longer a mouth. It was a mirror. And for the first time in her life, she liked what it showed. On the day she passed, the sky did not darken. There were no screams, no shadows, only stillness. Only the wind pressing gently through the stalks as if carrying her forward. The villagers did not dig a grave. They carried her to the field, wrapped in linen stitched from her own hands, and placed her beneath the white tree. No stone, no name, only silence and a breath. The following spring, a new bloom emerged beside the bench, a pale violet flower unfamiliar to the village. It opened at dusk and hummed, and the children said it smelled like memory. This was what grew from grief. Not curses, not crops, not plagues, but truth and choice and rest, and the quiet knowing that even the deepest sorrow, when finally spoken, can bloom into something that no longer asks to be dragged, only
understood